think, increased perceptual capacity is definitely an advantage in the workplace. We did some research. This was me with my wonderful colleague Rosie Cope, where we were exploring what autistic people felt were their skills and abilities within the workplace over and above their non-autistic colleagues. And lots of the strengths that people highlighted seem to map onto these differences in information processing, like superior pattern recognition and memory, attention to detail, better sustained focus and intense focus. So I think, already a lot of autistic people are probably aware of those strengths, but actually there were so many other strengths in creativity, innovation, efficiency, all these personal qualities like honesty, being loyal, being more dedicated, unique perspectives, all of that.
Greetings and welcome to Working to Work. I'm Sam, and this project, this podcast, this YouTube channel explores the intersection of neurodivergence and employment. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Anna Remington, who is the director of the Centre for Research into Autism and Education at University College London. It is a conversation that I've been looking forward to having for a long time because Anna is one of the primary researchers, academics that explores a cognitive function called perceptual capacity. Perceptual capacity refers to the amount of information that we can pay attention to at any one time. Why is that particularly interesting to autistic people? Well, I feel it's interesting because research suggests that autistic people can process more information at any given time than non-autistic people, and thus have an increased perceptual capacity over the majority. And this can lead to benefits in a sense that autistic people have generally a superior perceptual skills, but also leads to challenges in terms of sensory sensitivities. It's not known whether this increased processing is specific to autistic people or shared by other neurodivergent people. And that's one of the things that a recent paper that Anna Remington was a co-author on looked into, the difference in terms of perceptual capacity and experiences between autistic people, ADHD people and the neuro majority, and also people with diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And how does this relate to employment, you might ask? Well, I feel a greater understanding of one's perceptual capacity can support people in seeking work that aligns with their strengths. It could also mean that one is more likely to be able to mitigate challenging sensory situations if one can identify what's challenging or what they need to be supplemented, then one can action that. Also, I feel in terms of this relates to completing tasks where sometimes one might procrastinate or make slower progress than is desired through augmenting an environment or one's sensory input that can support the individual to staying on task and realizing that task that they want to do in a satisfying way. There's tons of other benefits that I have in mind, some of which we cover in this episode. I think also an increased ability to articulate to others one's strengths and also challenges and how the latter might be mitigated is incredibly useful, like having the language and knowledge to be able to talk specifically about what one needs and what they're good at and why is really valuable. And I think that's why part of why perceptual capacity is fascinating to me and what we look to cover in this episode. I'd like to request as well, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the Working to Work YouTube channel. I think that helps in terms of YouTube spreading the word and spreading the content. Also liking the videos and commenting because I'm interested in anything you have to share or want to ask. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and I will come back at the end with just a few final thoughts following up on some things that were touched on in this episode. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me, Anna. Something I've been looking forward to for a long time. The work that you do is really interesting. I wonder if you can perhaps introduce yourself, what CRAE does in general and what your role is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Anna Remington. I'm a professor of autism research at UCL and also the director of the Centre for Research in Autism and Education. And what we do there, of course, because we're a research centre, we try and do cutting edge research, but we also put equal importance on making sure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from it. So all of our research is very applied, and we do a lot of public engagement activities. We also take a participatory approach, which means that we work with autistic people, not on autistic people. So we have autistic staff members and students at all levels within our centre.
So there's a lot of the work that you do is very interesting to me in respect of different elements of the autistic experience, and particularly that relating to employment. And I know you've done work on employment recently that I'm fascinated by, but for this interview, I wanted to mainly focus on the notion, the I don't know what you would call it actually, the reality of perceptual capacity, because from my perspective, perceptual capacity it can be a challenge for autistic people, but also a great strength if recognised by the individual and by employers and applied effectively. And you've recently part-authored a paper called A Storm of Post-it Notes, Experiences in Perceptual Capacity in Autism and ADHD, which was a very enjoyable read and a really cool title, I think, for an academic paper. I wonder if you could speak to from what perceptual capacity is and why it's of particular significance to autistic people and potentially the greater neurodivergent community.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, two main focuses in my research in general are skills and abilities and employment. And the story behind that is that around almost 20 years ago now, I think, when I started to work in this field, the narrative was really negative. So everyone was talking about attentional deficits and disorder. And as I started the research, I didn't find any of those deficits. I found differences, but those differences didn't mean that autistic people were experiencing worse attention. It was just different. So I started to focus more specifically on that. And I definitely don't want to ignore the challenges, many challenges that autistic people encounter compared to non-autistic people. But particularly at that point, so much of autism research was focused on the negatives. And in fact, even many cases where studies were showing superior performance, it was like repackaged as a negative or a disadvantage for autistic people. So everything was sort of overly pathologized. So I think there was one example of a study where autistic people were shown to be more moral, more honest, and that was marketed as a fail because in that particular task it was not desirable, apparently. But all of that led me to a career that was based on this understanding of strengths and abilities, particularly with respect to attention and perception, and then, of course, the practical application of that, which was, for me, looking at employment and education. So within that, we began focusing on perceptual capacity. And perceptual capacity is the amount of information that you can process at any given time. Everyone's perceptual capacity is slightly different, but the key thing is, and this is all based on Nili Levy's load theory of attention and cognitive control, and what she's explained is that you have to assign your full capacity at any given time. You can't hold some of it back. So you process automatically everything that you possibly can. And if the task that you're doing at that moment fills your capacity, then that's all that you'll be processing. But if it doesn't, if there's not much information involved in that task, then all the spare capacity that you have automatically spills over and processes irrelevant, non-task related information. And if there's nothing external, then that extra capacity can turn inwards and might lead to more mind wandering, daydreaming, more anxiety, rumination. And so the reason that we thought this was a really interesting idea is because potentially a difference in your perceptual capacity can really change the way that you interact with the world around you. And we've done a number of years of research looking at this and found that in general, autistic people seem to have a higher perceptual capacity than non-autistic people. So that what that means is that at any given moment, an autistic person can and therefore does process more information than their non-autistic peer. And like I said, I think this is interesting because it can explain some of the positives and the negatives of the autistic experience. So, for example, if you're doing a task that's got lots of information involved in it, then having this extra capacity is going to be really useful and helpful and lead you to be more efficient and more effective at the task. And that does seem to ring true with autistic people's experience of being able to engage with very complicated tasks that have a lot of data processing, for example, more effectively than someone who's not autistic. And that's what our research showed too. But the flip side of that is that if you're doing a fairly easy task that doesn't have much information involved in it, having extra capacity can make it much harder to stay on task or focused. So right now we're having this conversation. I'm sure you're finding it fascinating, but it's definitely not filling your perceptual capacity. So it might be harder to stay on task. You might be thinking about what you're going to do after this finishes, what you might have for lunch. And I think this fits also with what lots of autistic people have said, and also famously Temple Grandin, the famous autistic professor, who talks about how she feels her ears are like microphones, just picking up everything indiscriminately. So there's this aspect of how in situations like that, focusing on processing more information can actually make it harder to stay on task. So that's why I think it's particularly relevant for autistic people and potentially other neurotypes, because as you mentioned, what we've just started doing now is working on a new project that's looking at whether this perceptual capacity increase that we've seen for autistic people in the auditory domain. So we've seen that autistic people can process more auditory information compared to non-autistic people. We've seen that for visual information as well. But over the past decade or so, all of the studies have been done with autistic people without a learning disability. So we were very interested in two things in this new project. The first was whether we would see this increase in perceptual capacity for autistic people with a learning disability, and also whether we see it for other neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD or Williams syndrome. So this Post-it note study that you mentioned, which we titled it based on a beautiful quote from one of our participants, so we can't take credit at all for that. And in that study, what we found was that we saw some real commonalities in the experiences of autistic people, people with ADHD, autistic people with ADHD, and then what we like to call neuroboring or neurotypical people, I think is the official term. We found a lot of commonalities, but there were very slight differences. We saw that the language that the autistic participants used about the way they felt they were experiencing lots of information. They talked about this sense of overwhelm, whereas the participants with ADHD referred to overload, which was this slight difference across all the quotes, which we think might reflect that there's this increased perceptual capacity for autistic people, but not for people with ADHD, where there it might be more of a difference in the way of maintaining attentional priorities, for example. But so very preliminary suggestions, but also backed up by a study that we've just completed, which isn't published yet. So this is sort of hot off the press. But we did a study where we were interviewing autistic people with learning disabilities and people with Williams syndrome. And we found there as well, there seems to be this slight nuanced difference between the experiences of the different neurotypes that we think might suggest a slight specificity with respect to this increased perceptual capacity, that maybe it's something that is unique to the autistic experience, but we need to do a lot more work to figure that out.
You mentioned my capacity to focus on what you're talking about. I think it's a really interesting one because this subject matter feels very true to my experience. And I'm thinking about, while I'm listening to you, what am I doing? And I'm definitely having to intentionally focus on this interview and try to block out the exterior sounds that I'm hearing. But that's not necessarily because what you're saying isn't filling my capacity. It totally is. And in order actually to engage in the conversation effectively, I need to proactively try to minimize those sounds in my mind, actually, as much as, but though I can't do it in a kind of actually in the environment, I can't shut out the sounds of the cars. So there is definitely some kind of work there which uses some cognitive energy, I think, and capacity to try and keep one on track. And I hope we can get to actually instances where having an external input can help one stay on track. So you mentioned in summary what the recent study found. I wonder how you feel those with greater perceptual capacity might find what is the right type of additional stimuli that will assist in focus, and how this is relative to the task at hand.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably we all do it very naturally. Like for me, I always doodle when I'm on the phone or when I'm on a meeting. And I think part of that is trying to fill some of my capacity with something neutral that doesn't compete with the task. And that really helps me stay focused. And I think that's the real key is, we don't want to lead to situations of like overwhelm, where you feel like you're processing too much and it's just totally impossible. But something that's very neutral, not going to compete, or something that's useful for the task. And I think this is where using fidget spinners or doodling or doing an additional task alongside can be really, really helpful. And I think what we need to try and do is push back against that assumption that the child who's perfectly attending is one that's sitting there doing nothing, staring at the teacher, because actually that can be hugely more difficult to stay on task compared to someone who's allowed to move around or draw or do a puzzle at the same time, something that at the minimum is neutral but might actually be helping with some of the learning.
Yeah, it makes me think of learning styles in education, how potentially when I go for a walk, for example, it's more able to kind of process. There's some movement there. There's external stimuli and kind of in that movement, I can work through a problem that maybe I couldn't if I was just stuck sitting at a desk. I'm not sure necessarily how that can be transposed into education, but I've definitely utilized it in work when I've given myself the permission to get away from the desk, recognize it's still as working, but just a way of working that works for me. So you gave that example of doodling, which I very much do. I think of examples where, say, something like listening to Brian Eno, ambient music can be really helpful because, as you say, it doesn't kind of interfere with it fills that capacity, but allows me to focus. And there's times though where I absolutely can't have any stimulus and external stimuli, and I need to focus, but at the same time having company around works, which is where I think going to the library I think is really effective. That's maybe a different subject about how one can stay on track. I wonder how might a greater perceptual capacity for an individual be a strength for them in the workplace, that both the individual can recognize and articulate to the employers, and employers can see actually this behavior, this mode of working is a benefit of the unique makeup of this individual.
Yes, I think increased perceptual capacity is definitely an advantage in the workplace. We did some research. This was me with my wonderful colleague Rosie Cope, where we were exploring what autistic people felt were their skills and abilities within the workplace over and above their non-autistic colleagues. And lots of the strengths that people highlighted seem to map on to these differences in information processing, like superior pattern recognition and memory, attention to detail, better sustained focus and intense focus. And so I think, already a lot of autistic people are probably aware of those strengths. But I should say, they weren't the only strengths that people raised. There were so many different, I think some of the information processing sort of maps onto that more stereotypical idea of autistic strength. But actually there were so many other strengths in creativity, innovation, efficiency, all these personal qualities like honesty, being loyal, being more dedicated, unique perspectives, all of that. But I know that's an aside, but I just wanted to throw it in there that those were definitely not the only strengths that were recognised. But when it comes to thinking about employers recognising, I think employers are definitely starting to recognise those strengths. But I think we also need to be really careful that people's worth is not measured based on like skills that they bring, that autistic people are not a commodity, that this is like everybody has value, and employment isn't for everyone, but there is this huge gap between the number of autistic people who want to work and the number of autistic people who can manage to find and maintain a work. So it's definitely an important issue to address. And I think one way to address that is to raise awareness of some of these strengths with employers, because I think there is still that lag that employers are a little bit behind the curve in understanding some of these perceptual skills. But I think there definitely are a huge number of skills around perceptual capacity that can lead to these advantages in the workplace.
Agreed. And without wanting to kind of link everything we speak about to my experience, but I think it can be helpful to give an example. I can think of a time where greater perceptual capacity and kind of to extend that by extension, attention to detail can be not particularly well received. So there's instances where I've worked as an audio producer where that attention to detail, where the fine tuning, where being able to hear the different aspects and the minutiae and be very focused has been seen as a benefit. I can think of a previous job where I've been told other people aren't going to recognize this, it's not that important, and effectively you're asked to kind of not downgrade, but maybe not put as much be as diligent as one might want to naturally in terms of the work that they're producing. And I think this very much speaks to finding work that really aligns with your strengths and the role that aligns with your strengths and one's kind of perceptual capacity. So finding work where that is going to be appreciated and you're going to feel fulfilled. I don't like this idea of these are particular jobs for autistic people, but what would you offer in terms of people that want to find gratifying work that does fill their perceptual capacity in a way that feels gratifying? How would they potentially think about what that might be without necessarily thinking it's going to be this industry, this profession, because it's going to differ because we're all interested in different things?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It's a great example as well, that I think there are great job matches within every sector, within every profession. And I think it's about, engaging with the recruitment team and trying to find out about a role, or for employers to start really thinking through the different roles and understanding what's crucial to that role, rather than just here's the generic job spec that we always use. Because, there might be some jobs that aren't as that maybe autistic people wouldn't like as much, and we're talking in stereotypes and every autistic person is different. So but if we have to talk about commonalities, there might be some jobs that don't lend themselves as much naturally, but with a tiny bit of modification, that could still be a really great job. So I think, I know this is a bit of a non-answer, but I think it really is about just speaking to an individual and trying to work out like what it is that you want from a role, what aspects do you find challenging versus which ones are really meaningful, and looking for a really fine-grained fit. Because I think you're absolutely right that it's the match between the job and the individual that's crucial, rather than being able to say this sector is particularly good for autistic people.
What I like about the idea of, I don't know how you define perceptual capacity. Is it a theory? Is it go ahead, please.
It's, perceptual capacity, I would say, it's a very good question. It's a cognitive function, I would say. So it's, it's part of attention and perception, but it's based on the theory, and that theory is called load theory of attention and cognitive control. But it's a function.
Thank you. Cognitive function. I'll try and remember that. What I was going to offer was, I think that it can be very empowering and liberating to have that kind of framework of I've already forgotten what you've called it, cognitive function, as opposed to, so for example, just going back to that experience at work, people saying you're paying too much attention to this, or like the too detailed. And I think, which then lends to one perceiving themselves as deficient, right? That's like not what is expected or not needed. And having that kind of framework of the cognitive function, one can think, okay, I understand what they're saying. They're saying that for this task, they don't believe it needs that kind of level of detail. I know this is slightly diverging from perceptual capacity, but by that, I mean, you're hearing things in an audio sense that others aren't hearing, that maybe the majority aren't, so they don't feel it's necessary to spend time on that. And I just feel that having this concept of oneself and their cognitive ability as well as being able to utilize it more effectively and recognize where you need support, is quite comforting. And thus, it would be great if this were a cognitive function that had more exposure in the wider society. This is diverging a bit from my questions, but how do you think that might come to pass so that this can be beneficial for more people, in not just autistic people, but people in general, in terms of understanding how to kind of do lots of things in life?
So I think actually Nili Levy, who put forward the theory that sort of built up the idea of perceptual capacity in general, has done quite a lot of work looking at the sort of the practical application of differences in perceptual capacity, because like you say, it's not just neurodivergent individuals. Everybody has a slightly different perceptual capacity, and across the general population, the idea of perceptual capacity, it does have huge implications for the way that we undergo tasks. So, I think she has done a lot to raise awareness of this idea and how it might have implications for healthcare, for advertising. I think she's spoken a lot about how that can help us understand what advertising is going to work, or why mistakes are made within the operating theatre for doctors. Like, it really does have application everywhere. So the question about how do you get it out there more, things like this, speaking on publicly available, accessible platforms, I think is really important. And my team and I, we try and do that as much as possible as well, to try and, because I think with better understanding, it really does help, because understanding that you have a slightly higher perceptual capacity or a lower perceptual capacity really changes the way that you might intervene in a situation that you're finding challenging. And sometimes it can be quite counterintuitive, because if you're in a situation where you're feeling really distracted, if you know that you have a low perceptual capacity, then adding more information is the worst thing you could possibly do. But if you know that you have a high perceptual capacity, then you might start to think, right, what am I going to add into this task to keep me focused on it, or at least not, have my attention totally elsewhere. So, yeah, I think it is a really important thing to know about yourself.
Yeah, and I can think of some quite obvious examples that people might do that they might not think of in terms of perceptual capacity, like doing dishes but listening to a podcast, or watching something, or listening to talk, or if you're cleaning or something, having some external. And it's not just to make, I don't think it's just to make that task less boring. I think it's to fill that perceptual capacity. And it definitely works. Just quickly, in terms of being able to get these ideas out there, do you think, foresee, or maybe it's happening already, that perceptual capacity would be something that's spoken about in DEI initiatives in organizations to gain awareness? So we talk a lot about, from my understanding of the differences, and in quite a kind of generalized way, but talking more about how those differences manifest, I think is potentially more useful, and maybe less stigmatizing to here's a group that's different, as opposed to here are the aspects of us that are different. I don't know if that creates a great distinction, but hopefully you know what I mean.
No, I agree. We do a lot of work with organizations where we are going in and offering that sort of support and training based on our research, where we are saying, look, these are the differences. And I think, often we get a lot of reaction of, wow, that's really surprising that, people didn't know so much about the differences in attention and perception. I think some of that is being done more generally when I think now a lot of training about differences with respect to neurodiversity does encompass sensory aspects. That's become much more mainstream, and the idea that you have to consider the physical environment in terms of lighting and sounds, and offering headphones and that sort of thing. But I think this is a slightly different take on it that I think should be added. And yeah, we'll do our best to raise awareness and understanding. But of course, we still need to do a lot more research to look at the real life applications within different settings.
Yeah, and I guess potentially a bit more difficult to not necessarily implement, but get people's head around, because it's not about necessarily changing the lighting or headphones or a quiet space. This is something that differs very much from person to person, as do kind of other sensory challenges and things that work for one. But this is a bit more abstract somehow. So I can definitely see there's a challenge, but then that a kind of exciting challenge to be able to translate that. So what challenges, maybe we've touched on this a bit, but what challenges do you feel that one, having a greater perceptual capacity in respect of employment, how might those kind of manifest? I've given an example from my own experience, but I wonder from your research, what else have you found?
Yeah, I think your example was great. And we hear a lot of examples that are similar about just, finding it very hard to stay on task when there's a lot of information, but yet so there's a lot of information around, but yet the task that you're doing is quite slimmed down. So if we're thinking about real specifics, maybe it's, trying to be working at a desk in a hot desking environment can be quite challenging, because then you're processing everyone's conversations. If everyone's on a call at the same time, I think it can be really, really tricky to stay on task if you're able to process something that's going on round the corner in another part of the office, whereas someone with a lower perceptual capacity would be able to stay on task because the task that they're doing would fill it up, leaving none left over for processing all those other conversations that are happening around them.
One of the core reasons I wanted to start this podcast was and the project in general, to explore my own challenges of employment, but also what strengths I have that I feel I wasn't able to properly present or kind of be appreciated. And I think having it's not necessarily a strength or a weakness, but I have a pretty big perceptual capacity, which I can now recognize how that's influenced different challenges and successes in work. I wonder, speaking about the strengths, what is an example you would give where having a heightened greater perceptual capacity than the majority would be seen as, or has been, an asset to an individual or group?
Well, I think you gave a great example of an auditory capacity advantage, so I'm going to give a visual one. There's actually a military unit somewhere where their role is to look at aerial photographs and detect targets from those photographs, and the unit is staffed exclusively by autistic people, because of that advantage in being able to pull out the information from that big visual scene much more effectively and quickly. And I'm sure there's loads of other examples like that we're not allowed to know. And another example that Australia's Department of Human Services has placed a lot of autistic individuals in various roles, and I don't know how they're measuring this, but they say that their neurodivergent teams are 30% more productive than the other teams.
Interesting. Given that perceptual capacity isn't as common in the vernacular or the kind of minds of society at the moment, what if an autistic individual or someone that believed they had a greater perceptual capacity is looking at a job listing, what might the basics, effectively the skill of having a greater perceptual capacity, be listed as a kind of responsibility or a kind of attribute currently on a job description?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wonder if it might come under sort of attention to detail. In my mind, I think that's sort of the closest that people get to it. Because having good attention to detail can often come from that increased perceptual capacity, because you're able to much more effectively take in a lot of information at any one point, and therefore pick out the detail more efficiently. So I wonder if people will start to use that term when they might mean increased perceptual capacity. Or the very classic data processing tasks. If there's a task that involves a lot of checking code, for example, if you've got a high perceptual capacity, you can probably do that much more efficiently. But I should say, it doesn't mean you're going to love it. So it's important to, I heard a really great saying, I don't know who says it, but, just because you're good at something doesn't mean you need to do it. So.
And also, if you are good at it, potentially it doesn't necessarily take up all your perceptual capacity. If you are a kind of natural, excellent coder, okay, you're taking in what someone else might perceive as a lot of data, but there might be potentially left over there that doesn't fill it, and you need a kind of more, not necessarily advanced task, but a different task that does. I wonder, maybe it's a bit of a trivial point, but do you foresee a future where perceptual capacity is on these job descriptions, and they have a kind of greater societal sense of what that means?
I don't know. I think that would probably be, I think that would be optimistic, probably.
What I like about it is it's quite precise in a way. If you do have an understanding of it, and the job description asks for a But again, it's relative to the task as well. So
it's relative to the task, and also it interacts with so many other things. So, you might have a really large perceptual capacity, but you might also have other attentional differences that mean that it's much harder for you to maintain the attentional priority. So you also have to spend a lot of hard work trying to block out. Because I'll step back a tiny bit, but we're automatically taking as much as we can. But according to load theory, we also, there's the more active process of cognitive control. So we can still decide what we want to focus our attention on. It's not just randomly, allocated. So it could be that someone has a larger perceptual capacity, but is struggling still to maintain those attentional priorities. So the two kind of work together. So I don't think it would be as simple as just saying, do this task, we'll measure your perceptual capacity, and now we'll know you're, set for a job. But I do think there's a lot of interesting points in that suggestion that I wonder if, a lot of jobs do use this sort of psychometric testing to try and profile people. I don't know how much of that testing involves like attentional styles or preferences or things like that. What we know is that some of this automatic psychometric testing really is biased against neurodivergent people. So I don't know what the answer is, but maybe including more of those attentional styles would be a good thing, but maybe not just in this automated way that doesn't account for differences in style or thought.
I heard this term psychometric recently, but I wasn't sure exactly what it meant. Can you just speak briefly to what that is?
Yeah, it's a sort of standardized approach to measuring something. So, for example, an IQ test or a personality trait test, where often they're automated and you fill out the questions and it spits out an answer that somehow defines you or your ability in some way.
You spoke about this a bit earlier, the lineage. I'm interested from to get to kind of the work that you're doing on perceptual capacity. Can you speak to a bit to, I forget their name, but what Levine, what they were doing? Was it Levine? And the load theory?
Nili Levy. She was working in pure attention research rather than thinking about neurodiversity. And she worked, this is going back, so there was, for decades and decades, there's been this long-running argument within attention about whether, we have to select some out of a number of possible options to pay attention to because our brain has a limited capacity for processing information and there's so much that goes on around us. We have to zone in order to, meaningfully interact with the world around us. And there's been this long-running debate historically about how that selection works. And whether we take everything in to a certain extent and then select in order to make a response, or whether we, very early on in the attention process, we zone in on what we're planning to attend to and then process it from start to finish. So it was within that debate that she started looking at why in some situations it looked like one of those options, and in other situations it looked like a different option, and no one could really work this out. And then her and her colleagues put forward this answer. Well, as in research, everyone has different views, and there's lots of competing arguments. But so I don't want to sort of misrepresent this as the only answer, but I do think this is a very meaningful and good answer that she realised when looking at the types of situations where people were experiencing the different options in terms of when you were selecting early or late in processing, she realised that what mattered was how much was involved in the task that you were doing. So she developed this idea of perceptual load being the crucial thing. So perceptual load is how much information is involved in the task that you're doing. And what she showed was that when a task has high perceptual load, so totally exhausts your processing capacity, then we very early on are only processing the task relevant information and don't show any distracted processing. But if a task has low perceptual load, so it doesn't take up your perceptual capacity, then we see a lot of extra distracted processing, and this looks more like that other theory of attention, which was that you're processing lots of things to quite a high degree before deciding in on the final bits that you're focusing on in order to make the right response to the situation. So that was her theory of her load theory of attention and cognitive control.
Is there a seminal paper that people could potentially look into if they were more interested?
Yeah, she's done so much work. She's like a real, absolutely phenomenal attention researcher. She's actually at UCL, so here in London. There's a great paper she's done in Trends in Cognitive Sciences from 1995, which I think really nicely sets out her theory.
Brilliant, thank you. Just thinking about like a kind of a sensory input with an autistic person potentially walking down the street where there's lots of sounds, lots of noise, lots of smells, it's not something necessarily that one can recognize, okay, this is an issue, but I'm going to cognitively tell myself that it's not. Would you say that there are workarounds in terms of headphones and minimizing the amount one is processing artificially, but it's not something that one can necessarily. Sorry, I'm kind of answering the question in the question, but you can tell yourself you're okay and kind of self-coach oneself, but you can't actually change how much your brain is taking in. Would that be accurate?
Yes, I think you've absolutely asked a brilliant question and answered it brilliantly. You're absolutely right. You can do all of these things to sort of artificially modulate the external environment, but ultimately that extra capacity has to go somewhere. And so, yes, if you're in a totally blank space with headphones on and no external stimulation, then I would argue you're still going to be using all of that capacity for inward thoughts, and that can, I suggest, might be why autistic people could have increased dwelling on certain thoughts. But then the flip side of that, there's always the flip side, is that many autistic people talk about having this very rich inner world that is incredibly meaningful and stimulating. So I think that's the other side of the story too.
Totally. And just to keep up the trend of giving examples from our own life when I think about them, when I don't want to be delving into that inner world because I go there quite a lot and I've spent a lot of my life there. When I'm walking, don't want to hear all the cars. I'm in central London. I listen to music. So the music takes up the capacity. I don't need to hear all the cars and all the noise, but I also don't necessarily need to delve into like my own thoughts. How do you think of the notion of perceptual capacity and flow intertwining? What's the relationship between those two?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I know the answer to that one. I think that they are related but distinct. So perhaps in a situation of flow, it's that all one's perceptual capacity is being used up. So there are no distractions and you're totally in the zone. But no, I don't think they're exactly the same phenomena. Though lots of people talk about the experiences of flow, I think they're probably distinct, but definitely, so related because they relate to attentional processing and being in the zone.
Yeah, I feel flow has to have a deeper investment as well as the kind of the one's kind of perceptual capacity being filled. So you can feel it, but be doing something that you could break away from. Flow, I think, involves more investment in the act. Which kind of leads me interestingly to this question about language. And you touch on that in the paper, and I think it's really fascinating. You kind of mentioned it in terms of the distinction between an ADHD experience, how one might define that as, was it overload, and autistic experience might be overwhelm, or vice versa. And I'm interested how shifts in language used to describe differing states of focus, which, as we talked about in attention detail, which relates to perceptual capacity, these ideas of to this or overload or overwhelm, how like changing language might destigmatize some of these states and kind of help them to be seen as advantages or strengths in certain situations, basically to frame them more positively for the individual and in wider society.
Yeah, I think language is really powerful. And I think within attention and perception, the really good example is the one that you've raised, which is considering the flow state. I think being deeply immersed in a task has been associated with being autistic since, right at the very first cases of autistic people being described. But historically that was framed so negatively, like people said it was based on an inability to be cognitively flexible, or that it was getting in the way of all other daily living skills. And then gradually, especially within the last few years, people have begun to consider that this is actually a really beneficial and meaningful part of the autistic experience. And I think now we understand that flow is a very positive thing. And, historically everyone talked about hyper-focus rather than flow. And hyper-focus is just, it sounds very medical and it sounds very negative and critical, whereas it's really the same thing. When we listen to people talking about what they would define as hyperfocus or what they would define as flow, it seems to be based on whether you're considering it from an aspect of this person is neurodivergent, or we're just looking at the positive aspects of being in the zone. So I think that's a really good example of how just using a different word for the same experience can totally shape your perception of it, and whether you have to try and change it if it's an experience, part of your own experience. It sounds like you need to do something about hyper-focus. Somehow you need to make it less hyper, but actually no one would suggest you need to remove flow from your daily experience. That's something very positive and productive and should be embraced.
Yes, totally. Maybe it's just the kind of the way the word has changed in the last 10 years or so. But when I think about hyper, I think of actually like a physical kind of intensity, but actually like a lot of kind of what people describe as hyper focus is actually probably in a relatively calm state of like investment in the thing and not kind of necessarily moving. Oh, it depends what you're doing, I think, but it's not kind of an erratic state necessarily what that hyper focus potentially implies. And it's one of those words, I think, hyper-focus, that's taken on by the autistic community as sometimes as a positive. But I think externally, potentially is still viewed negatively. I wonder, like, maybe it's not something you can answer, but how you think that, is there room for language to change in the general kind of vernacular, and how that might happen, and whether you could see potentially something like perceptual capacity being integrated into autism diagnosis, so which is a bit more accurate, I think, and a bit more neutral to one's experience and less deficit focused.
I think language definitely can change. I think we've seen a lot in the recent decade or so, looking at the way that previously everyone described someone who had a diagnosis of autism as a person with autism or a child with autism. And that's really shifted now with the understanding that, yes, there are big differences and debates on this and no one consensus, but within the UK, there seems to be a preference within the autistic community for the use of identity first language. So saying autistic person rather than person with autism. And I think we've really seen that shift being made, and within the research literature, within social media, within publications, all of that, we're very much seeing this preference for identity first language, and that's not something we would have seen 10 years ago. So I think definitely language can change. I think a lot of the changes have been driven by autistic-led organisations, autistic self-advocacy, and I think that's really important. And I think wherever possible, that's what we're aiming to do, is just to, amplify the voices of the autistic community. And I think that's the way that we get those changes, even, within the diagnostic manuals. I think really it needs to be driven by the autistic community to make sure that it's a meaningful change and that it's not just, presumption of what might be better.
Yes. And I think things change based on, I like being precise with what I'm trying to express. So if I think that hyper-focus, for example, might have people have different perceptions of what that means, either negative, positive, whatever. If I'm trying to express something related to my perceptual capacity with more understanding of the notion, one can more accurately articulate what they're experiencing, so that we kind of move a bit from, I don't want to say buzzwords, but kind of like terms that are either stigmatized or not necessarily able to explain to someone else what you're trying to say about your experience. And I think so. I guess what I'm saying is I hear you, and maybe organically greater understanding of all of our minds enables us, and kind of having the terminology enables us to kind of speak to our experiences with more detail.
Yeah, I just want to add though that we do find that in general, autistic people in our research tend to have higher perceptual capacity, but it's not the case for everyone. So I think we're a way away from that being part of like the diagnostic test. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that if they're not sharing that experience of increased perceptual capacity, that it somehow means that they're not autistic or in any way a worse autistic person. You know, there are so many differences. So I think what's currently in the diagnostic criteria is this aspect of different sensory experiences. And I think that probably at the moment is a better framework for understanding the differences, because I don't know yet whether we would be able to say that every autistic person has increased perceptual capacity, or even what percentage of autistic people have perceptual capacity. That's something I'd be very interested to understand, is, you know, what differentiates people who do and don't have higher levels of perceptual capacity. Does it relate to sense? We know it relates to sensory sensitivities. We've done some of that work, but does it relate to anxiety? Because we know that anxiety can change the way that you process visual information if you're looking for threats more readily than someone who has lower anxiety. So I think the whole thing is so interwoven that it might be a bit of a long shot to hope that there might be some sort of conclusive test of perceptual capacity that works within the diagnostic process. But for sure, I think understanding that might be one aspect of the different attentional or sensory experiences that an autistic person is having, I think is really important, because like we already discussed, it really changes the way you might intervene or try and support your own challenges that you're encountering.
100%. And I'm so glad that you brought up that aspect of how kind of increased anxiety might potentially increase one's perceptual capacity. That is something that can expand based on their experiences and circumstances of life, that their perceptual capacity can increase to contend with like the increased fear potentially, or anxiety that one feels, which resonates to a certain extent, unfortunately. I also just wanted to mention, when I was just describing, talking about my experiences as in more detail, not necessarily thinking in terms of like in the autism diagnosis or referring to all autistic people, more in fact the opposite, about not needing to tether to a term like autism, which is so broad as well, but having the language, I think, and ability to communicate precisely what aspect of myself I'm trying to speak to. I think we've covered a lot on perceptual capacity, and it's been a really genuinely fascinating conversation that I hoped it would be. Thank you so much, Anna. I wonder if there's anything else that you felt was worth sharing that we didn't touch on in relation to perceptual capacity.
I think you've asked an absolutely brilliant set of questions, and I've really enjoyed our discussion, so thank you so much.
Okay, welcome back. Not that you went anywhere. Hopefully you were listening throughout the whole thing. I want to thank Anna again for taking the time to speak with me and share the thoughts and the research that they've done. I had an outstanding question after I edited this interview, which was around whether one's perceptual capacity can expand or decrease. So we spoke in the interview about how perceptual capacity can't decrease, but one can find ways to mitigate challenges of an increased perceptual capacity in certain situations. But there was another aspect of the report that we touched on a little bit, which was about how anxiety can potentially increase one's perceptual capacity. And I think this was an interesting point that wasn't massively expanded on in the paper, in terms of how one's life experience can increase how attentive to one's environment they are. And I think there is a slight distinction there between perceptual capacity and then the more perhaps conscious, also a bit subconscious, I guess, attention one has to their environment. So for example, if one has situations where they felt physically under threat or scared or fearful, one might be a bit more attuned to different sounds that potentially can trigger danger in order to safeguard themselves. And perhaps this isn't necessarily an increase of one's perceptual capacity, more like a kind of a tuning of how they use that perceptual capacity. So perhaps before you could be more tuned into the birds and sounds that one finds more pleasant, and instead, because of one's experiences of anxiety or fear, or one tunes into potential threats more. I did ask Anna about this, and their response was, there is some research about how perceptual capacity might change in different situations. For example, it changes with age. But they said they don't know enough about whether anxiety actually increases capacity or just broadens the scope. And they offered a few papers that touches on this more. So I'm going to link those in the show notes in the description on YouTube. They also mentioned that there was some talk about perceptual capacity being increased in video gamers, but then that was countered. And I'll share that research as well. So yes, again, thank you to Anna. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe and like and share and comment, because that engagement will buoy me a bit, but hopefully also spread the project and spread the awareness of this cognitive function, which again, I think can be beneficial to all people, but particularly autistic people and neurodivergent people, as a way of explaining what to themselves and to others, what they're experiencing and what they need to thrive. Because I think sometimes maybe referencing a condition like autism or ADHD doesn't necessarily tell the other person what one needs. And because the experiences of these conditions differ from person to person and from person to person in terms of their understanding of what it means. So I personally feel that having kind of more nuanced and precise language and understanding of what's going on for someone can help them address those particular issues as and when they come up, and again, represent them as strengths that they can share with others in terms of seeking employment, but also utilize in their work, in the things that they do in their life, because they are great strengths. So again, thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and until next time, I wish you well, take care, goodbye.